thank you for coming. When I was trying to figure out what this meeting was all about, I had a chance to speak with Chris. He was really kind. It was about midnight his time when we got a chance to connect. And we chatted about a bunch of things, and one of the things he says, well, be provocative. So I've tried to be a little provocative. I'm going to try and be a little more provocative in this talk, just to, as a group, it's nice to kind of push thinking. And you may not agree with me, that's okay, but I don't think hopefully you won't fall asleep. And we'll see what comes out of this. And what I want to do broadly is give you a little sense of the organization briefly that I'm with, and then I'm going to, and so I modified it, so this probably isn't quite what you expect, so I've changed it a little bit. I modified what I was going to talk about based on what we heard today to try and weave a little of what we talked about into it, and then maybe either present those in kind of a summary or a new way, and then put forward a couple new ideas for us to chew on later, maybe. So I am at the William Davison Institute, and I'm also on the faculty at the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. Just really briefly, what do we do at the Davison Institute? I mean, we talked about, so this is the university bit, right? We're part of a university, but if we don't create new knowledge, what's the point, right? We're at a major research university, but our goal is to create applied knowledge, things that have immediate practical implications. So we want to do something that we can use out in the field. We also like to play the role, to some degree, of we have this, if you will, base of the pyramid space we think is very important. And one of the things we do is we, once in a while, try and convene some of the leading thinkers. So I don't know if any of you went, we had a big conference 2 years ago, about 400 people came to Ann Arbor to talk about these issues. We've got another conference in this October, which is more of a by invitation only. We're developing an edited book. It'll be myself and CK and Stu Hart and Al Hammond, kind of taking the field where it is now and saying, okay, here, this is around 10 years. So where are we now, and how do we move it forward? And we've kind of co-created the book. The authors met last week in Ann Arbor. We're actually going to kind of present our current thinking to a group not unlike this, and have them kind of help us develop our thinking along the line. So it's a fun, I think, a very different way of creating a book where we're actually going to co-create it together. And then certainly, one of the things we do is we like to share expertise. Of course, I teach, we develop cases, and we do a lot of partnering. That's kind of a way for us to ground truth, kind of our work. And this gets to the question of partnering is hopefully we create something interesting and people contact us and say, how can we work together? We're less likely to go out and reach out to people, but we want to figure out where there's intersections of where we think we've created something of value that our partners in the field think that they've created something of value. And that, to me, and that gets, somebody mentioned over here, I think it was Jocelyn, you mentioned about mutual value. It has to make sense for both of us to do this work. And we also have a lot of students, so we use them in a number of our projects as well, and they're pretty sharp folks. So this is my call to action, and this aligns with what Chris said earlier, right? So 20 years ago, I left consulting, and I went in the Peace Corps, and I went to Malawi, okay? And I did small business development. And I'll ask you, what is this picture? Who's in this picture here? What is it? Who are they? Carlos? No idea. Anyone? I'm looking through a window. What am I looking at? A classroom. This is a classroom. Kids in a classroom. I took this picture in 1989. So then, about a year ago, I was in Ghana, and I took this picture. What is this? Yep. 20 years later, what has changed? Right? I think Chris said it really well. Development has not worked particularly well. Look at the kids in school. The situation isn't all that different. So, it's not that development has failed. It's development has not achieved as much as it might have hoped to. Now, one of the challenges, we were just talking over lunch, is if you read the development literature and how successful they've been, you would think we've solved all the problems by now, right? But it's not true. There's a lot more work to be done. And what we're trying to do is say that there's a complementary way of thinking about poverty alleviation. And this is what we call the base of the pyramid domain. It's not better than, it's just different and hopefully enhances what already goes on. And the fundamental premise is this idea that we need to combine separate domains of business strategy and poverty alleviation. For a long time, business has been about serving the rich, and the development community has been about serving the poor, and they don't really work well together. And how do you bring them together? How do you make poverty part of not philanthropy, but actually part of strategy, and what does that mean? And in some respects, there's some things that would suggest there's alignment, right, at a broad level. The business challenge, we already talked about, top of the pyramid is getting saturated. Where are the new opportunities for customers? Where do we find those low-cost suppliers? Businesses are always looking to sustain growth and look for new opportunities. And what are the development challenges? Well, by God, they got too many customers, right? They lack They like new opportunities, and fundamentally, I think we've beat this to death, there's a challenge of scale, which is one thing businesses are very good at, right, is scale. So can these come together? And there's kind of a fundamental question that we've been knocking around, but I think this is sort of the core idea that we might want to think about. Can business motivations for profit and growth be aligned with the development community's efforts to alleviate poverty? And you may say, how much profits? But you know what? That has a lot to do with how much is subsidized. Every single business in the U.S. gets a subsidy. We just have failed to take that thinking to the developing world and said, well, businesses that serve the poor, they have to make it on their own, right? So profits are adjusted by how much is subsidized. So, I mean, we sometimes we ask the wrong questions and we get ourselves trapped. But it's really this alignment of can you bring some sort of profit-making mechanism in alignment with this idea of poverty alleviation? And embedded in this is this core hypothesis of mutual value creation, right? That it makes sense for everyone, that companies or the organizations that are involved are going to make money, the nonprofits are going to achieve their social goals, and hopefully we'll be able to alleviate some poverty. So that has to happen, right? And in this work, so we've been around doing this for a while, and I like, Nishant's work, but one of the challenges is it's like continually reinventing the wheel. And this is one of the frustrating things for me, is that we've been doing this, and people kind of come up with new reports, but it's really the same thing again. So, I mean, we need to remember that there's been some work, and then where does it go from here? So I thought I'd take a moment and say, here's at least the way I've thought about how this field has emerged. And it's emerged over three ways. One around kind of landscape business opportunity. How big is this market, right? We've had this rather kind of, I think, silly debate about, what's the exact cutoff for the base of the pyramid? Is it $1.28, I mean, that doesn't make any difference, right? I mean, we can always argue about a cutoff level, but that's not really all that important. There's issues around, we've done a lot of work on business strategies, market entry. What do businesses need to do to be successful? And that's been going on about 10 years. How do you enter this space? And what we spend most of our time, because it hasn't been, is how do you bring these business strategies into the poverty alleviation domain? So I'll just show you real quick. This isn't certainly not all the literature, but maybe some representative pieces. This argument, is there a fortune at the bottom of the pyramid, right? Blah, blah, blah. And I think it's, in my mind, it's been talked about. Al Hammond and his colleagues, Francesco at WR, you weren't involved in the report, but you're at WR9. They did a really interesting piece on, at least one take on the market. And I don't know that it's perfect work, but it's kind of the best piece, at least, to say there's a market opportunity. But what it fails to fundamentally address is what's the role of intermediaries in BOP development? So what's the role for all of you in doing this? And this gets to a broader idea, is what's the role of subsidies in this space? What do we need to subsidize? Think about how you serve the poor in the U.S., right? Do we count their disposable income when we say, are they a good market? Or do we start looking at things like food stamps? And say, wow, they don't actually pay for it, but we're subsidizing it, and they don't go to the government, they go to the supermarket. And we have to start bringing some of that logic and saying, instead of getting all tangled up in, is this profitable, how do we actually together create a new market, right? It's not about one that's discovered. It's been discovered. If it existed, it'd be occupied. We're trying to kind of co-create a market here. Then this is where most of the work has been done. There's tons of work that's been done. I've done a lot of work on what I call business model R&D. So I do, I don't do a lot, well, I do a bit of consulting, but when I work with companies, I can pretty much go in and see how they're set up and tell them pretty quickly whether they're going to fail. I can pretty much predict failure. I can't always predict success, but you can sort of see how they're designed with their models, whether they're really going to get to the base of the pyramid. You think about structure, incentives, resources. So we have some sense of that already. I think your point's well taken, and Stu Hart, of course, has done a lot of work on kind of hearing the voices of the poor. That's crucial in the design, that we have to change how we think about the poor, right, from just the helpless to actually colleagues. And then lots of work on 5 or 6 years ago, what are the right capabilities that firms need to enter this space? How do you build the right business models? How do you get socially embedded? And then lots and lots of work on cross-sector partnerships. How do corporations and nonprofits? That's not a new field. But there's a lot of work in this space, how they, what are the key issues they need to think about. And then a little more on outcomes, and it was mentioned earlier, one outcome is this idea of disruptive innovation, that, some things at the bottom may actually migrate up market. Clay Christensen's disruptive innovation, an interesting piece with Stu. And I've just done a piece with a couple of colleagues at Michigan around this, kind of get our hands around this idea of what does mutual value creation mean? And what are we really talking about when we're saying that and trying to do that? One thing that hasn't been done, and this is what I was originally going to talk about, but I'm not, because I'm going to change on you. What are the core principles that guide BOP venture development? So if you're a manager, what do you really need? So we have something called the BOP Venture Scorecard, which you can turn and say, here are the things you need to think about. It's a pretty good set based on our experience of what are the steps or what are the issues that ventures need to think about as they move through the process of design, implementation, and outcome. So it's a pretty useful tool. What I am going to talk a little bit more about is the poverty alleviation side. And some of you may know, I just said this piece out, so it's a little self-promotion, right? So if you read this month's HBR, well, it was actually May, but it's still I went to the airport kiosk when I got here, and it's still here in Europe, although it's June now. But it's around this whole idea of impact assessment. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it, and this is some of the work that we're doing underneath it. But there's two things that I'll put up. One, which I won't talk about, is this idea that if we're going to talk about base of the pyramid, right, we can't just talk about venture strategy. We have to say, how are we contributing also to the poverty alleviation domain? BOP is not microfinance. They're two fundamentally different things, right? The BOP perspective is a different poverty alleviation approach, right? And that's something we're working on articulating. We have a pretty good handle. Again, I'm not going to talk about that, but if we don't demonstrate that, then we don't really have all that much to say other than to the corporate sector, right, or the nonprofits, the venture development sector. But we think it's also a complementary approach to things like microfinance, value chain, enabling environment, BDS, some of these other things that are already out there. It complements, doesn't replace, but complements. But I'm going to talk, because we spend so much time talking about it, I think monitoring and evaluation is a failed ideology, so I'll be provocative. I think it's never going to work. Who of you wants to be monitored and evaluated? Sounds pretty awful. It's imposed from the outside, and it sounds like a cost, right? So I think it's the end of monitoring and evaluation. But there are some alternatives. So should we do impact assessment? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we need, and this is a, say what? I'm going to get there. Just be patient. I mean, we need to what frustrates me, I used to work for Conservation International. One of the things we used to say, it wasn't really me, it was colleagues to say, the forest is going to be, somehow it'll be gone somewhere between, it's degrading at a rate of 5 to 20%. So my colleagues would always say, well, 20%, the forest will be gone in 5 years. Next 2 years later, the forest will be gone in 5 years. So it was kind of using data to their advantage, and a lot of nonprofits use their data in terms of anecdotes. And that's how they share their work. And to me, anecdotes are cooking the social books. If that's all you got, that's completely insufficient. You can do better than that, because I think all of us would agree anecdotes are selected, set, and they're biased. And even with an anecdote, you're only getting the positive. And it's unconscionable that the best we can do, if we require companies to report and audit on their financial reports, and we don't do that for nonprofits, we're letting them get away with, basically it turns into organizational survival. I want to present myself as well as we can, versus the idea of actually achieving poverty alleviation, being as honest as I can. So it becomes, sort of survival versus learning. And I think we've got to change that mode, and this will get to your point, Chris, that, I think the right way to frame this is we have to move from monitoring evaluation to assessing and enhancing. And it may sound like words, but it's not. Monitoring evaluation is backward-looking. It's sort of looking back at what you're doing, and it's developed for donors. What we're trying to do is create a strategic tool that allows managers to actually assess what's going on and enhance. But the big challenge in that is recognizing you're not working perfectly, right? I mean, and one of the challenges we often face with our ventures is we don't want to report what's not working, right? And we have to, because that's the only way you get better. So we tried to create a tool to kind of do this. We think, so we have a lot of organizations, not a lot, but a number of organizations that have used it because it guides future strategy. And then the logic's pretty simple, right? If you're running a company in the U.S., you darn well better know the customer's reactions, right? You got to know what's going on the ground. So what are our customers thinking? That's sort of understanding the needs or what's going on poverty-wise on the ground. So many organizations run their ventures and they say, I don't have time for M&E. I don't have time to understand what's going on the ground. That would never fly in a regular business, because if you can create value, if you can understand what's going on the ground, you can make your business better. If you make your business better, you ought to make more money as well as better alleviate poverty. So again, it's that hypothesis of mutual value creation. And then this is our big effort. So this is where we want to go with this, is the one thing we don't really know, right, is what's the relationship between business strategy and poverty alleviation, right? So if I'm running a business, this happened in the environmental field, like kind of what was the low-hanging environmental fruit? What are the things we can do for an environmental side? 3M was really good at this, pollution prevention. What can we do real fast? And we can also turn that around from a business side and say, okay, what's the low-hanging poverty alleviation fruit? If we, what could we attack first, if we will, to get our foothold? And more important for all of us is, if we have a particular poverty alleviation goal, say women's empowerment, what types of businesses do we want to promote? And strangely enough, we don't know that. We don't really know the relationship between business strategy and poverty alleviation. So we're doing a lot of work to begin to kind of aggregate and collect that data. So, and I'm running out of time, but we do have this BOP impact assessment framework. If you're interested, I'll send you a copy of it. It's out in HBR. But what it tries to do, and we're very specific, or I'm very specific, it's only measuring local impacts. Okay, it's got nothing to do with business outcomes. We don't care about how many malaria nets were distributed, right? That's an outcome. That's not all that interesting. Well, that's not fair to say. It's not as interesting as knowing what is actually happening on the ground. How are we impacting poverty? And we define poverty as first we think of it as multi-stakeholder, right? So it's not just a buyer or a seller. Most business models have locally either a buyer and or a seller in a community. So we see there are multiple stakeholders, and then there are multiple dimensions of poverty alleviation, right? We all agree about economic, but poverty is not just about income, right? I mean, there's very much the Sennis approach about capabilities. We need to build people's capabilities, their dignity. A lot of other aspects go into that. And then, of course, poverty is also about isolation. So how do you begin to change relationships, how people think about gender, things like that? So we sort of said, this is a framework, and what you want to do is then begin to think about the positive and negatives. And every venture has a positive and negative. Microfinance sounds great, we give them money, but oh what? They got debt. That's not a good thing. So what happens if somebody, I forget, somebody saying, 10% of the debt goes bad. What happens to those people? If we're going to alleviate poverty, do we care? At least we should think about it. If we're empowering women, there could also be more violence in the household. As anytime you disrupt the status quo, there's going to be people that don't like that. So what we're trying to do is get in front of these issues. One of our partners said was the most successful women entrepreneurs they had the most conflict with their husband, and they were most likely to drop out. So the bad outcome for poverty alleviation, bad outcome for business. They developed a strategy to get the husband to be also involved in the enterprise. It's better for the enterprise, better for poverty alleviation. So again, you just want to understand what's going on and have a deeper sense. And this is my last slide, second to last slide. It's really saying that this framework can be used, one, at a high level, that you can go out in the field and get a sense pretty quickly of what's going on in your model. And donors can also use it to compare. One, they can sort of say, can someone that's coming to me actually fill this out? If they don't know what's going on the ground, I can either use it as a tool to teach them or use it as a tool to say maybe they're not really ready for this kind of work yet. And then you use it to both improve your business model, and then we also do a lot of data collection. And there's this false thought that to do rigorous data collection, it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. It doesn't. You just have to understand things like power size, how do you get a natural control group, and it's pretty economical to do this. And then you actually have a system in place where you can track your changes over time, and if you change your business model, you can see the change on poverty alleviation. And that's where we're going to now. We're seeing more and more organizations adopting that. We'd like to see, whatever model it is, I think we have to do that. So, I'll just kind of stop here. Let's just say we're using a lot of organizations. I put this picture back up only because it's this idea of reframing that, and this doesn't apply so much to you guys, but when you look at the picture, you can't look at that as, say, the poor, helpless kids. You got to say, wow, those could be my future colleagues, right? And how do I work with them? So you have to reframe I think part of our challenge is to reframe how we think about the poor, and I don't think that's such a big issue for our group, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.